already stating Prime Minister to get us a debate here and there.
Does this work or something?
Sorry?
Does this work?
Don't worry about that. You got it.
Alright.
Say that again? Okay, guys, please. Okay, cool. Proceed.
Alright, is this audible enough for the panel? I'll start my speech in 3.
Just a second.
Okay.
Let's
I'm sorry for sorry, please, like, when I was in charge, the tone of your whisper, please try to raise it instead of making it it's kind of, it's echoing. Sorry, please. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Alright, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Social expectation to leave a legacy is incredibly a bad thing. It is bad because it is found on the principle of abolishing or denigrating the rights of individuals, and even if it is not true, the pragmatic effect of that has been very dire and we regret it. Firstly, we think a legacy looks like 2 things. Firstly, leaving an amount of money or property to people behind you, possibly your family members or your friends, right? Possibly something huge. It possibly could also look like 2, the long-lasting impact of particular actions or events. That means that your vocation or your profession ought to leave a mark that stands the test of time. What does the expectation look like? It looks like 4 things. Firstly, economically. It means people in society are expected to not just live comfortable life or not just aspire to live comfortable life, but to be possibly affluent people, most likely the richest person in your village or in your community. That's what it might look like. And we see this commonly within African communities where children are constantly almost framed to aspire to that level of influence. But 2, vocationally, it means society expects you to value some particular vocations or professions over the other. Mostly in Indian communities and especially in African communities, people mostly expect your children to become doctors or lawyers or engineers. What that also means is that there's a simultaneous denigration of other forms of profession, like being a vocational trainer or being a teacher or being a mason or something of that sort. But educationally, people don't just expect you to do well, they expect you to be the best within your cohort. Most likely aspire to be a valedictorian or something of that sort is what it looks like. But lastly, on the political aspect of it, likely they want you to maybe aspire to some political leadership, being a member of parliament or being a member of the Congress or maybe presidency or something of that sort. And we see it constantly from high school all the way down to primary school. How does this play out? It plays out in 2 ways. One, sometimes it's directly. That means parents or society directly coerce people to choose particular options. For instance, when it comes to choosing what vocation you want to study in the university, some parents have the right to force people. Example, Tyler, I'm sure we all know Tyler, was almost forced by her parents to choose to mining engineering in the university even though she wanted to be a musician. And secondly, sometimes it's indirect. That means either over glorification of certain professions or vocations or certain ideals has the psychological effect on people's ability to choose what they ideally want, and that obviously is the means by which society creates that expectation in that regard. What then is our metric of regret? 2 things to know. 1 is that we think it is wrong in principle. 2, we think it has caused more harm than good. Before I continue, see.
Yeah, you don't prove why it is in society's interest to force you to do something bad. For example, society needs shoe shiners so that everybody's shoe is clean. Why would they force people out of those if all those things also would?
So the problem is that society's coercion is built on the assumption of universal capacity. They assume that everybody has the capacity to achieve to the highest ideal. I think it's practically impossible. But secondly, society's expectation also directly undermines people's moral agency. They just use people as objects of achieving a higher good. We don't think that works in the world. Our first argument, therefore, is on moral agency. We say that this expectation has greatly diminished moral agency in 2 ways. 1 is that it has greatly reduced the capacity of people to choose what they want for themselves. A lot of people, particularly in some of these high niche professions, didn't go there on their own. They were literally coerced by society into some of those positions. Why that is bad? Because it directly undermines the autonomy of people as moral agents who have the capacity to choose what they want and be who they want and be what they want. But secondly, it also psychologically frames people's decision-making calculus. Even if they are not directly forced, you create expectations by setting up what the standard is and why you should aspire to that standard. Why is this bad? It is bad for three reasons. Firstly, it is wrong in principle because it attacks the most important property of people, which is their moral agency. But two, it creates a paternalistic precedence by which society continuously coerces people into choices against their will, and which that is bad. But thirdly, it worsens inequality. You know why? Because most of the poor, the poorest of the poor who we make poor, don't have the capacity to overcome the systemic barriers that prevent them from aspiring to the highest ideals, like possibly being a millionaire or being a politician or some of those regards. By creating that social expectation without reducing the systemic barriers, you force people, you worsen the inequality by creating a system where people are blamed because they are unable to aspire to those ideals, even as bad. But secondly, on existential crisis, before that,
a legacy subjective.
You can come and answer that. Secondly, I think existential crisis, you know why? Because most people, especially after they have been coerced into certain identities or certain positions they don't want, they feel less satisfied. They most likely are feeling some form of detachment from what they are being forced to do as opposed to what they ideally want to do. Why is this important? Because one, people are unable to give up their best because this is not really the ideal position they want to be in. But secondly, the psychological impact of this. We have a lot of instances where medical students in Ghana took their lives because the decision to enter medical school was not their choice, was coerced on them by either their parents or society, and we think that's something that's bad. But even those who are practicing professionally, there are high rates of suicide, high rates of divorces among multiple people in some of these positions because they're inherently unsatisfied, and then that's a lot of inertia towards the passion of their job. We think that's something that's bad. The third argument from my side is on social cohesion. Note it's simple. We think that this social expectation has led to less collaboration within people in society. Why? Firstly, it has increased competitiveness. You know why? Because legacy is a limited commodity. If all of us are millionaires, we all can leave a legacy. You can only leave a legacy when you are possibly stand way above other people. That means people have been forced to think that competition is a way by which they live a legacy. But secondly, a sense of bitterness, because that social expectation means that they are constantly comparing you to your neighbor or to someone else. That means that even when your neighbor is successful, people are not happy unless one of their own is also equally successful. And that sense of bitterness is bad because one, it reduces the overall level of peace in the society, but two, it limits the ability of people to collaborate and cooperate without something that's bad. What therefore is our counterfactual? First, we prefer a world where individual autonomy supersedes societal collective decision to impose particular actions on people. It doesn't mean that society can't have an influence on people, but we just wish a world where people have the ultimate say on what they want to be or who they want to be in that regard. But secondly, we prefer a world where society's influence on people is not an expectation. It's not a standard set up for them to follow. That is say, where people can decide to be a musician instead of a lawyer, and society shouldn't have a problem with that in that regard. Why is our case important? Because one, I think the principle of moral agency supersedes anything you are going to get from this side and possibly by extension from CEO, and as like any argument that business has to prove utility that supersedes the utility of moral agency. And for all those practical reasons, we are so proud to propose.
Thank you, the Prime Minister. Now call upon the leader of opposition to start off their case. Here.
Am I audible?
Sure.
All right. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. The social expectation to leave behind a legacy is inherently a narrative. So what it looks like is that constantly there are narratives, or there are like narratives that inherently encourage you to leave behind a legacy. What does it look like? It looks like its manifestation in things like art. So we have the Coco movie, which inherently enforces people to live good lives and remember, so they ought not to be forgotten when they die. It also looks like encouragement. Your parents are encouraging you to go a step further, inherently to do things, to leave behind a legacy, to inherently be better than them. What this also looks like is that the narratives inherently beget infrastructure that inherently helps you to achieve this particular goal. So if your parents expect you to leave behind a legacy, they'll put in a lot of investment in things like your education and try to like inherently create a world whereby you're in a better position or you have a comfortable environment to leave behind that legacy. It also creates a world where if society does this expectation, society also has a burden or has a responsibility to create infrastructure. So like what do you mean? They'll provide you with the social welfare, the social amenities, the education, the healthcare, etc. to put you in a better position to what do you call it? Create this legacy. Thirdly, one important thing must know about narratives and things like expectations is that they are counter narratives. So in addition to the infrastructure, there are other narratives that exist to make sure the fulfillment of a legacy is a positive one. Because as CEO flag, in which we extend on, is that society doesn't have an expectation or doesn't have an incentive for it to leave behind a bad legacy or to do bad things or to do things that will not make you happy. Meaning that there's also going to require, society is also going to require certain narratives, like things like do what makes you happy. Because when you do those things that make you happy, inherently become more successful and get more legacies. That's why things like counseling services exist in status school. That also career guidance services. So if inherently you're not feeling happy with the course you are doing, because your parents forced you, society has made provisions to like mitigate that impact by encouraging you to pursue your goals or pursue your passions. At the end of the day, that mitigates a lot of things that like coercion that OG tells you. Because at the end of the day, there are other counter narratives that exist that mitigate the impact of these things, right? And the also tell you, legacy is subjective. Not everyone has the same legacy. The legacy is inherently dependent on the context or the surroundings within which you exist in. Right? At the end of the day, it also creates a world whereby there's an infrastructure and there are other competing legacies that happens. What happens in the process of you living a legacy? It looks like, first of all, setting minimal goals. If I want to achieve a particular legacy of being the best debater that this continent has ever seen, first of all, I'll set up a goal to try and consume a huge chunk of the workshop that exists. Then my second goal is to be competing in various tournaments. My third goal is to try and win those tournaments as possible. At the end of the day, there are various levels of goal setting that inherently come together to coagulate in order for you to leave behind those legacy. But within those goal settings in of themselves, you inherently become a better person because you then incentivize to improve your skills, inherently enhancing your ability and capacity to live like be a good person. But secondly, notice after I fulfill a particular goal, I feel a sense of fulfillment or a sense of happiness. I think that's a positive impact and that's a utility that you can't get in our words, right? So our first impact is a positive utility of comfort, a sense of fulfillment, even in the process of reaching a legacy. I think that's something that inherently we shouldn't regret. One impact why we shouldn't regret the societal expectation of leaving behind a legacy. Also, it means that you are incentivized to break out of restraining environments because at the end of the day, you are incentivized to break out of oppressive structures that deny you from leaving behind these legacies. Also, another important thing, society expects you to leave a legacy. But the type of legacy you have, like what you want to do to reach that legacy, is a decision you make on your own. It's a conscious effort you make on your own. So at the end of the day, even though society expects you to leave behind a legacy, you still make the decision on what legacy you want to do. This will incentivize you to pursue your own pleasures because inherently you want to be remembered for doing something great. That's why in India, even though you mentioned people are expected to be doctors and lawyers, we still have people who are artists, we still have people who are not doctors, etc., who pursue their own pleasures and they are still successful. At the end of the day, like what it is, that can be a case in today's debate. Our first case, right? There are the case of moral agency. We flip that in our world, right? So on how we enhance the moral agency of individuals in society. At the end of the day, I think human agency, one thing that inherently strips away human agency is death. Because you don't know how you die, you don't know what causes death, you don't know what happens after you die. And so you can't control the certain factors around your death. You're not able to control how you are remembered after you die. At the end of the day, in a world whereby people are expected to leave behind their legacy, and they actually fulfill this expectation and leave behind legacy, it creates a certain matter of utility. Because inherently, we create the moral agency. Because at the end of the day, you're able to control how you are remembered after you die. So inherently, you're able to know how people remember you. Because you are incentivized to do things that inherent society will respect, or society will praise you. That will be considered a legacy. Why is this inherently important? In a world where I can't control what happens after you die, at least there's a certain level of agency that will give you by controlling how you are remembered after you die. I think that's a certain level of agency. That's a very important. But secondly, Theo,
we just have a question of clarity. Why are parents societal expectation and not familial interpersonal expectation?
I think at the end of the day, societal expectations begins into individual expectations. So inherently, the same thing. There can't be a case in today's debate, right? So at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, so first of all, the impact, we enhance moral agency because we give individuals the ability to control how they are remembered after they die. We enhance moral agency in our world, right? Second case we bring into this debate. The second case is that social expectation helps individuals to be incentivized to advance social change. Why is this possible? One, individuals inherently have an incentive to leave behind good legacies. They have an incentive to be good people. But secondly, because you have been indoctrinated or you have been taught to leave behind a legacy, you are incentivized to act on it and actually leave behind a legacy. Inherently, so this expectation translates to thought. Because inherently, we inherently do what we are taught. If you are taught not to steal, we inherently do not steal. So inherently, once you are indoctrinated or you are incentivized to leave behind a legacy, it inherently translates into action. So individuals actually act in a way that inherently puts them in a better position to leave this legacy. Why is this inherently important? Also, another incentive why people have towards another incentive why people have an incentive to leave behind good legacies is one, there's a certain level of utility that you get when you leave behind a good legacy. The amount of praise, the acknowledgement, and the respect you get from society and people around you. Two, more people are incentivized to interact with you, to have more social capital. And three, it's able to help you fulfill your esteem needs, which are inherent for you to actually self-actualize as an individual. At the end of the day, these are incentives that inherently create a world where people are incentivized to leave behind legacies and act on those expectations. Why is this good? One, on an individual level, you feel that sense of comfort. But two, on your immediate environment, since you are incentivized and you actually expected to be behind a legacy, you are actually putting in the work to help create a world whereby your family is well taken care of. And not only your immediate family, but even your grandkids. You're inherently invest in yourself to be in a better position to provide for your grandkids and the people around you. But three, it looks like individuals also have the capacity creating advancing social change or huge amount of change. That's why billionaires engage in things like philanthropic work and do active duty like donations because they want to actually be remembered and actually want to leave behind good legacies. It also translates to things like social movements and social individuals actually fighting or actually creating a world whereby they want to have the legacy of breaking systematic barriers. Inherently, this creates a world whereby individuals are incentivized to be good people, creates a world whereby you do not want to regret legacies. Thank you.
Right. Beginning the speech in 3, 2, 1. Why has opening opposition lost this debate? Their case is premised on the assumption that the social expectation is harmless and that there is no pressure within it. Why have they lost from that point? Firstly, because it's not fair for us to have that debate. If the social expectation doesn't put any pressure on individuals, then there's no argument on this side. But secondly, understand that the subjectivity of legacies is illegitimate in this world because the social expectation does not take into consideration the subjective ideas that people have. It looks more like a dominant narrative where a narrow set of standards is widely prioritized and believed in. So even though I feel as if winning PAUDC is enough of a legacy for me, majority of the society wants me to have like a university degree or become a doctor. That is the case from this side. They do not engage it charitably. But thirdly, Understand that human beings have different capacities to achieve goals. So even in a world where we buy into their subjectivity arguments, they still lose. Why? Because legacies place an unfair burden on human beings to work for things that they will never benefit from, especially in worlds where they are born with a lower capacity to achieve those things. And that's going to be my extension. But before that, why do we also beat closing opposition, right? They say that this is why, they say that every society needs poor people, right? That's the POI that they ask. Now this is why, even though every society needs poor people, the social expectation still affects these poor people intimately, right? Shoemakers and what have you, for two reasons. Number one, elitism exists. We live in a world where finite resources exist. And people who fit into the standards of a high-class person, i.e. the kind of person who would be more proximate to leaving a legacy, enjoy a higher quality of life. It looks like enjoying better nutrition and health care. It looks like enjoying lesser priority of problems. For example, my problem is I'm concerned with breaking to the next stage while somebody hasn't paid their school fees, right? So at the end of the day, people have different capacities to achieve their goals, like I've already said. And there are two impacts to that on people who are less likely to leave their legacies. Number one, there's aspirational duress. Because you look at people who have very comfortable lives, people who enjoy better nutrition, better healthcare, better quality of life, and you want that life. So regardless of the fact that you are a shoemaker and you are still utile to the society, you still face that societal expectation to want to buy into these things, right? But the second thing is the social ostracization that exists. Because even though we know that shoemakers and what have you have utility within the society, we still treat them poorly because there is still a certain kind of stratification that exists in the society. We respect doctors and lawyers above certain other professions, and it happens on that level. All of this means that this social expectation is one that not only exists for disadvantaged people and for minorities, but actually exists even more for them. And that is terrible because it places a greater pressure on people who, through no fault of their own, have lower capacity to meet that standard. What extension are you going to get from me in this debate? I'm going to explain to you why legacies are terrible concepts in the society and why, on that basis, we can regret that there's a social expectation of people to leave legacies. Now, why are legacies terrible concepts in society? Number one, understand that they assign value where proportionate effort has not been made to earn it. This is important because in principle, when certain people in society benefit disproportionately from a particular system, when finite resources exist, it constitutes an active disenfranchisement of every other actor in that society. The question in this debate is, which people actually benefit from legacies? I'm going to analyze to you two beneficiaries. Number one, the person who created that legacy. And that person is the most minimal beneficiary in this debate, right? Why do I say that? Because the actualization of a legacy is only realized after death. Because during life, that legacy can always be destroyed. It means that the person who creates a legacy doesn't ever enjoy the full effect of that legacy during their life. But the second reason why this is true is because personal achievements are diminishing returns. So in life, we are primarily concerned with leaving the biggest possible legacy. So largely, we are never able to stop and just be satisfied within ourselves with the legacy we already have. And that's the first harm in this debate, right? It's an ever-shifting finish line. There is no catharsis because you are always moving on towards the next thing. You always want to grow your legacy. But the second beneficiary are those who are direct beneficiaries of these things, like your children, your family, your friend, your loved ones, your community, right? People who benefit from tangible inheritance or from influence. It looks like children of politicians or popular musicians achieving privilege in their lives, or a politician building a school within their community, right? These people are more respected, they gain more access to resources, their interests are better protected, they are richer, and life is easier for them. But this is why it is such a bad thing for the entire society to perpetuate a narrative where the measure of a person's worth is dependent on how much of a legacy they leave. Because that metric is inherently elitist and isn't fairly distributed nor appropriately stratified in the society. Closing.
Yeah, apart from the fact that this guy says it's considered that's why it's bad, and you are arguing that legacies in themselves are bad. Why he says that when an individual no longer has a purpose or goal to achieve his best in the world?
Right. We don't think that the expectation of legacies is the only thing that gives people's lives purpose. We think that inherently human beings have things that motivate them. And that is what feeds into our world. Because, see, it's not symmetric. The way up, let me engage this. The pushback from up is that inequality exists anyways, right? That argument is not symmetric. Because the social perception of a legacy accentuates that inequality that already exists and places it on a higher pedestal. It's a metric for evaluating the value of a life that strengthens and legitimizes inequality in our society. It means that all their concerns of people, for example, wanting to be artists and instead being forced to be doctors, rather fits into our world. Because in our world, there's no pressure to meet a dominant narrative within the society. There's no pressure to conform to a societal narrative. Why do we win on the bench, right? We engage this debate holistically. Firstly, we challenge the idea that legacies are inherently a good thing. I'm answering to POI. Secondly, we also prove that the social stratification that exists and the assignment of value and respect that is performed on the basis of this metric is also bad. And thirdly, we show you how a world without this expectation will still be functional because human beings will always have an individual desire to achieve self-actualization. It's better in our world because people are more free to set goals and assign value on their own terms without the society telling them what they should prioritize. We think we've done everything, we win.
Thank you, DPM. We now invite the already standing DLO to continue. Here.
Is that ready? Okay, I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I would like to establish that lottery of birth and the context and capacity and environments that people exist without the social expectation to have a legacy. Why this is important is because the alternatives that they create and the social stratification case that they run cannot work. If you give an example of lawyers or doctors or some particular vocations having respect, it can still exist without the social expectation of a legacy because these people are still going to be paid more and these people are still going to be having a higher influence. Why our world is important and why we shouldn't regret it is that even inherent in the stratification of class and why people would still give respect to some particular vocations, people who are not within that class or below that class will still have a reason to go beyond themselves and do what is good for them within the capacity within that they can do it. Why the alternatives can't exist and alternatives of minimal goals can't exist? It's because the opt-out then is easier if you do not have a bigger picture of leaving a legacy. What then that means? That mediocrity becomes normal and it's easier for you to not sacrifice or it's easier for you to be convenient because you have an incentive to not give it your all because you don't have a bigger picture of leaving a legacy. But why that is also true is that you don't have a greater incentive to make the sacrifices that you would make for yourself and even beyond that for your loved ones or your children. And that is why the alternatives of not having legacy cannot run in a world where you want optimum utility when the bar of being a good person increases every day with environment. Why OG is out of this debate? Because Willow characterization gives you that the process of leaving a legacy has some things that you do not get if you are not going to leave a legacy. Things like being disciplined, things like constantly wanting to move outside your box and increasing your capacity, even if the environment you engage in does not have that capacity. What then that means is then you have a moral, you have an agency that gives you a moral, implicit, inherent incentive to do something that is good for yourself without feeling that kind of pressure because you have a bigger picture for yourself. What that then means is that you can't say that it undermines your autonomy when that person makes a conscious choice and a conscious commitment to make sure that what they are doing is good for them. But why that can't even be better or why that can't be bad for their psyche is that the fulfillment that comes with the process of leaving a legacy makes it even good for you, so much so that even if you don't get the end goal or you don't live to see the end goal, the purpose of leaving a legacy is that beyond your death or after your life, other people who are related to you can have that incentive. But what is even good for their second beneficiary that DPM preaches is that you now have an inherent pressure as a person who is living from the legacy of others to make it your optimal position to leave a legacy, not necessarily the ones that your person has left. Because in the characterization, you you now know that you have a societal expectation to leave a legacy that might not necessarily be the legacy that you've lived on. Why this is true is because a lot of people were shamed, and that is how we have Picasso leaving a legacy of art, one of the industries that are not as respected as law. Or we have people who still want to find the cure of cancer, knowing very well that even if it's going to happen in 30 years and they wouldn't be there because they are 89 years old, they will still be in the books of it and they would have had a contribution to healthcare. Why that is important is because of William's case on utility and why you're able to create a better world for people, because society does not even have an inherent incentive to make the world a worse place for you, because even if they're going to benefit from it, they put a pressure on you that makes you better in and of yourself, have better fulfillment and have a better purpose. That can be the belief. But the psychological effect and the existential crisis that PM runs cannot win, because William's characterization shows you that there's a conscious commitment to making sure that you create a bigger picture you choose for yourself. Because the best and furthest society can do is to let you know that you have a role to exist outside of the box that you are in, or to exist outside of the environment. Because a couple of things go into creating a legacy: your context, your capacity, and your environment. What then that means is that if your context is not favorable to your capacity, society does not have an incentive to shame you or to blame you because you are in an environment that does not make that capacity true or even achievable or plausible. What then that means is things like backlash and shame and psychological effects cannot even run in their world, because society knows that you are in an environment that limits a certain capacity. What then that means is that they appreciate you choosing the kind of box from which you want to come from. What it means for the minorities and people who can't plausibly create legacies for them. It means that the people that can have the capacity and context and environments to do so have an incentive to decentralize that legacy, that which is minorities who might not have even be able to create that legacy. How this works is simple. If you are in an environment, that makes it easier for you to leave a legacy, because the person that was before you left a legacy and a greater capacity for you to be a better person than yourself. You have a less incentive to be mediocre and exist in a box where you could have been a better person. What then that gives is society an incentive to even shame you, even if you're in a better position than a minority person, and put you on a pedestal of being a better person for yourself and for the minorities that can give their best because of the environment that they engage in. What then that means for government policies and leaders and people that have the resources to be better people is that you do not have an excuse for not being a better person, because there's a capacity that was given to you that you have an incentive responsibility to make use of. What then means for minorities and for people who can't even do that, you decentralize the power and the capacity that you have as a person to make sure that whatever legacy you're going to leave goes beyond you yourself, because you have a greater environment to implement that. CG.
What happens to the people that fail to achieve legacy in your world?
The process that goes through leaving a legacy that mitigates the failure that comes from a legacy. Because inherent in William's speech is that you have to create some sort of chronological way of making sure that you get into the bigger picture. And the little fulfillment that you take in and of yourself gives you some sort of fulfillment that you don't get if you do not paint a bigger picture for yourself. What happens in their world is that there's no big picture to look forward to. And so things like little failures are most likely going to demoralize you or push you down or give you the aspirational duress that you talk about, because there's no bigger picture to look forward to. So things like failures affect you more because you do not have a bigger picture or pieces to to look forward to or to create change for yourself. But what it means for sustainability of self-preservation is that beyond death, you are still able to sustain the resources that you have, and things go beyond you, because you won't live forever, and you will have people that come after you that might not even be your relatives or might not even be your loved ones, but there will be people that will exist in your industry. So Picasso has a responsibility for other artists he would have never met to make sure that there's a sustainability of the industry that he has existed in because of the capacity and environment that he lives in. What then that means is that if you're able to create a context and a capacity and an environment to live a legacy, you have a responsibility, because society tells you to live that kind of life for betterment. Proud day to oppose.
Friedrich Nietzsche describes failure as so. A bird is flying in the sky. It gets tired. It has no capacity to fly anymore. It rests on a rock. It looks up and it sees another bird continues to fly. The problem with the opening opposition's case about pressure is they don't prove that pressure generates capacity. The bird cannot will itself to fly if it does not already have the capacity to make that distance. Then, the bird that does have the capacity to fly is already flying and so does not need the pressure. There's a problem in the opening opposition case. But the second problem is they are actually defending subjective expectations on their side. We know this because they say legacy is contextual and they like that. 2, they support the idea of the pressure coming from parents who have different value metrics. They never actually defend general social expectations which derive from social norms, like established in today's debate by our opening government, the idea of leaving money behind or creating university degrees. So we can actually flip their case and argue that we get more subjective expectations by not having objective societal expectations. Therefore, we regret societal expectations because it interrupts the very sort of subjective legacy that the opening opposition would want in today's debate. But even if we evaluate this debate as it's just a debate about pressure, whether objective or subjective, they have not addressed the issue of capacity. Because all the people that fail to achieve the metric on their side, 1, don't accrue the benefits of creating legacy, but 2, are only going to feel like failures because they're now comparing themselves to the expectation they could not meet. On our world, the people that fail do not feel like failures, and the people that succeed will going to succeed anyway. Okay, so what is our case? We're going to separate this debate into 2 actors. The first actor is that bird in the sky that continues to fly. These are the geniuses, the people that create legacy, the people that are able to fashion their age. The second actor is the bird that rests on the rock. These are people who do not succeed in creating legacy, who do not succeed in being geniuses or fashioning their age. And our extension is that the social expectation, whether objective or subjective, is bad for both of these parties and is regrettable. We must start by asking ourselves, what actually gives you the capacity to succeed and makes you great? The first is that you need tools to actualize your ideas and develop your capacity. An example of this is Judith Polgar, who ranked in the top 10 chess players in the world despite being a woman, because from the age of 3, her parents who were chess players gave her lots of training materials and tools. Those parents were not motivated by a social expectation for women to play chess. That would be absurd. They were motivated by giving their daughter the tools to be great, and as a result, she achieved greatness. The second is that some people simply have the interest to actualize ideas and capacities as a categorical imperative and not a hypothetical imperative. Why? 1, they might be born with strong internal will. Secondly, it might just be genetic randomness, like a savant who's born with excessive genius capacity, or genes that make you excel at sporting activities. But 3, it might also be the expectation that you place on yourself despite the world, but not because of it. And we think that that is important because people like this are more likely to be geniuses in today's debate. Now, they might sometimes say things like the social expectation made them great, but we think that the factor that really contributed to their greatness are those that we spoke about earlier, not yet. Okay, so why don't we like social expectations for these geniuses? The first reason we don't like it and we regret it is because it creates pressure to validate yourself against social domains. Even if it's just validating yourself against your parents, we think these geniuses ought to pursue the categorical imperatives within themselves because they are more attuned to those imperatives, those are more natural to them, and so the genius within them is able to actualize better when it comes from within them rather than it comes from within others, so they accrue better benefits and better legacies. But secondly, there's this inability to really predict what kind of future society will think about your work. So we'd rather have you just focus on your work and not focus on what kind of output your work might produce. But 3, we think that exact pressure to compare yourself might undermine the genius that is within you. And so we'd rather have these geniuses just continue to fly in the sky because they are already good at doing that. So I'll take a POI before I analyze my second actor. From closing. From opening.
You base your argument on societal norms. The societal norm is not to drop out of school. Bill Gates had to drop out of school to give a legacy to Microsoft. You don't need societal norms.
Our argument is not based on social norms. We just argue that you were supposed to defend defend them. Our argument is that the pressure is not needed for those who are not going to drop out of school, and pressuring people to not drop out of school doesn't work if they don't have the capacity to not drop out of school. They're going to drop out anyway, but now they feel like failures because you created the expectation. In other words, the incentive to do well doesn't give you the capacity to do well. You must have the capacity to do well. They don't prove that they create that in today's debate. So let's look at the second actor, and this is probably the most important actor because most people are going to be this actor. These are the people who are unable to fly continuously in the sky. Now, why do we not like the social expectation upon these people? We think that even these people will have categorical imperatives. It's not just geniuses who are able to fashion their age and have interests. And this preempts, the idea that came from the opposition bench that without the expectation on legacy, people won't have any goals, they won't have any purposes, they won't have anything that they pursue. In fact, we think legacy is a hypothetical imperative, which means it comes from the society around you. But each person is imbued with will and agency, interests and desires, which is what creates uniqueness within us. And that's why we are different people, the subjectivity that opening opposition concedes. We'd rather have the people who are going to fail in our world create alternative goals. So instead of trying to create legacy, something they're unable to do, they can focus their energy and attention toward other sorts of activities that give them meaning and fulfillment within life today. Why we regret the social expectation then is because people undervalue these alternative routes and alternative goals that can still validate themselves and those around them, no longer can pursue them, and reduce the amount of greatness and beauty in the world because they're pursuing something they cannot pursue. But secondly, even if they do pursue their categorical imperatives, they feel bad about them because these are the sorts of imperatives that don't create legacy. They no longer feel like they are an important person who has contributed significantly to themselves and to other individuals. And so we'd rather not have a social expectation that tells them they're failures, but instead validates whatever route they do choose to pursue. Ultimately, we don't want pressure or expectation to succeed. What we want on our side is the validation of any person's categorical imperative, regardless of what it is. Because we think that even if you're the bird that rests on the rock, you matter. Thank you.
Priya, do you know what you for? Are you going to want it for?
Starting in 3, 2, 1. If you cannot fly, walk. If you cannot walk, crawl. No matter what happens, keep moving forward. The definition of failure, according to Desmond Dovlo, is not the birds looking at those flying and comparing themselves to it. It's society's failure to be realistic and understand that a bird cannot fly forever. The problem with their case is that, one, they do not prove that the only way to be known or have a legacy is if you continuously keep flying. The second issue is they do not prove why it's in society's interest to forcibly coerce you, even if it's not possible. But the last thing that they do not prove and understand to us is the reason why that alternative of focusing on yourself is something that comes from within you. Let's start, because their debate is essentially what these guys have. Because let's get to this place where they see that the best thing is to establish what you want for yourself and do what you want, and no societal pressure, no form of legacy. The question brings, what is individual freedom, and at what point do individuals make such choices? In sociology, individuals are born tabula rasa. What that says is that nobody comes to the world holding a note of what they need to do and who they need to become. At the point where the individual makes that decision that I want to do this for myself, that this is who I want to be because I am making it, who tells that individual with nothing written within their head before they come? It's still society. What closing government speaker needs to do is to prove to us systematically why, devoid of society, devoid of any sort of interference, human beings innately have a reason from God to say this is what they need to do. Let's start by taking opening government down. 3-4 things. One, notice how they put the debate exclusively in opening up and economics. They talk about things such as social stratification, they talk about things such as the jobs you need to do, etc. They do not tell us why other jobs, even if they are not elitist, are not needed, and society puts these people out of these places. But the second thing that these people do on their side is that they do not give the they do not show the incentives for people to stay and just help themselves and move forward. I'll attack this in my frame. 3 things in framing. 1, why legacies exist on a spectrum. Would like to say that legacies exist on a spectrum. You do not always need to be a godlike legend. That is why we have people we attribute to the gods. For example, Jesus Christ, people like Muhammad, etc., that have actually affected people's lives to a huge extent and changed their worldview, changed how they do things. The barriers to becoming these people are incredibly high, and society knows, and they do not push these people to those places, and we'll show you that. Secondly, we think there are people that once from generations, and people do not expect them to become those people. For example, we can still appreciate individuals like Erling Haaland, people like Kylian Mbappe, without saying they must be Ronaldo or they must be Messi. That is why fan bases exist for those people. So sure, maybe Thiago's bed cannot fly, but Thiago's bed can go. It can rest, it's alive. It will have people who always praises for what it needs to do. It does not always need to fit the definition that Thiago gives explicitly on that side. But the second thing in today's debate, and framing that critically means as a debate, is that the barriers to entry to what is being having a legacy has not been objectively inquired into this debate. The problem that exists in this debate is that, one, these guys say community context affects how you are there. They do not say what these community contexts are and why these things are incredibly likely. One, a lot of places where people demand individuals to leave legacies are places that require those people to come from. So, for example, communities like the LGBTQ community needed somebody to move for them, to become the person that liberates them. But the problem for those individuals is that there are things that militate against their existence. You might be killed. When you go to court, these things might go against you. What makes those people go in that regard? But secondly, there's no saturation in how good you can become, right? There's always places for people to make so much money, it cannot end on any side. But the last thing that appears here is that there are little things that we say people are good for. Maybe you are a very, very good friend. I know, for example, that people here have touched my life in so many ways. For me, if they left an imprint on my life, being a legend does not mean you make the greatest thing that nobody has ever seen. It means you leave a legacy. A legacy is an imprint on another person, and that is the smallest thing. Which means being a really good father, that your parents, people can always appreciate you. There are fathers in your communities that your people tell you these are really good parents. When you grow up, become like them. They tell you when you become a lover, become really good. Be like Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, because they stay close to each other, not because they have billions of dollars, but because they were really good in their little things. Even if your job is to be a street sweeper, sweep the street so good that even the host of heaven will look down and say, this is the best street sweeper that ever existed. The last thing that we are going to talk about is that spaces where legacies are needed are people who are not there. I think I've already spoken about that. Let's move to the next thing. First thing, there's a first mover problem in spaces where the legacy needs to be big. So for example, people who need to solve problems, like Rosa Parks sitting on that bus, knows that she could be racially attacked, she could be killed. People like Obejefu that took the USA government to court to legalize LGBTQ etc. knew that there were harms that were coming against that. The problem is in their world. What forces people to change those things? What are the trade-ins that people think about and think that it is valuable for us to reach rich things such as our lives, rich things such as our money, live long lives, spending the entirety of my life studying formulas to be able to help people defy gravity, etc. It is this principle good that we trade in, that we herald their name, that we preach their names for time and time to come. What we prove here categorically is to say, on our side, there's something that we trade in for these people. There's that remembrance that is always there, that these people do those things, etc. They are there. What this means is that comparatively, on our side, when change needs to occur, we give something a trade-in, which is that remembrance. We give that thing such that individuals can remember you are achieving for names for OG.
Yeah, so your argument of spectrum is problematic because it creates the reason for society to always raise the bar. That's why.
No, why would they raise the bar? You see, that's the problem. You don't analyze it. Why would they raise the bar? Like, let's all ask him, why would they raise the bar? There's nothing to prove that. The next thing there is the creation of role models. As I established in my frame, people who need to reach the top are people who come from most places where a lot of times individuals are not there. For example, we need to help and motivate them to get there, and when they return, you know that they can help you. What exists here is that in a lot of spaces when you become a legend, you feel a gap that is not there. So for example, if you're from a poor society where people do not go to school, individuals help you get to the top, and then you become the person that's there. But they do not prove the incentive, and that's what Chamu asked, and that's why Chamu is beating them in that regard. The incentive is that within them, they know that if they help you get there, you are very likely to come back to help them in that regard. You did not say that. I've been very credible to you guys. You did not say that in today's debate. What happens here is that that idea that people can help you is what proves people to create the structures that these guys say. That missing piece of mechanization is when you take the impact on these guys, their side, that when people help individuals and coagulate and form those infrastructures, it comes back to help them in that regard. The last thing is purpose and hope. Individuals need reasons to live till the day they die. When they have this thing that they're creating legends, or they're just getting a legacy, they do something that keeps them occupied, and they do not live in perpetual nihilism, proud to be from prison opposition.
The path to the peak of Mount Everest is littered with the skulls of those who failed to make it to the top. A disproportionate celebration of success exaggerates the likelihood of that success, which makes people who fail to achieve it, even though they're in the majority, feel like they're in the minority. People who are predisposed to success, geniuses, savants, exceptional individuals, do not need the pressure of succeeding in order to actualize that. It happens regardless. In other words, pressure is not a prerequisite to making it successfully. A few rebuttals then to what you get from the opposition bench. I think the first thing we'd like to respond to is this running idea on opposition that in the absence of pressure, people are unable to actualize because people have no internal motivation. To the extent of proving this, Desmond tells you that humans are born tabula rasa, and this makes them a clean slate that needs societal pressure in order to succeed. We think that this is false. We think, for example, the idea that geniuses like Albert Einstein, Vincent van Gogh were incredibly lonely and unpopular people despite the social expectation to have friends means that these are individuals who are immune to social expectations and will succeed whether those social expectations exist or not. But secondarily, we think they then burden themselves to prove when they argue that social expectations lead to success, that the presence of a social expectation necessarily means the creation of tools to actualize that social expectation. OO to this respect tells you that the narrative that you ought to leave a legacy begets infrastructure to achieve that legacy. Note how they never mechanize this claim. Our counterclaim is, if anything, there's a reduced incentive to create that infrastructure because in order to leave a legacy, you ought to be exceptional. You ought to rise above the odds. We think that that means that there's less of an incentive to create that infrastructure that they never prove exists because individuals have to be exceptional. They have to be special all the time. The second thing that they tell you is that society encourages you to do things for you, and this is, again, to the claim that the legacy is subjective. We think do what makes you happy is a counter-narrative that is trying to diminish the narrative that you ought to be incredibly successful and famous all the time. We think this narrative arises as resistance to the societal expectation to create a legacy. They can't claim that those two things are related sequentially. Then they tell you that there is comfort and a sense of achievement for individuals who, again, reach the top. Those who get to Mount Everest peak and are able to take the selfie. Those are the 2% of people who are able to actualize that sense of comfort and achievement. Note that 98% of people that don't achieve, 98% of people are the bird that has to stop to take a break. They don't achieve. They then have to suffer from this feeling of being inadequate. Lastly, they tell you that people are incentivized to break out of repressive environments, and this is a good thing because then you diminish the prevalence of mediocrity. Like, we think this is a reach. Again, this plays into the survivorship bias that their case rests on, that their case is premised on. So because there are people that are able to successfully get out of repressive environments, they then fallaciously assume a causal link between the pressure to become successful and the few people that eventually become successful. We posit that because there are people that succeed in the presence and absence of pressure, pressure is not a prerequisite to success. But we tell you that the unique thing that pressure does is make the people who don't succeed feel inadequate. And that's the harm that they ought to contend with in today's debate. Before I move, sure.
Society thrives on making sure that people are better people because it affects society. It is that incentive that moves society to create the infrastructure for you to make sure that you are performing your legacy, that you choose to perform. Engage.
On this claim of a legacy being subjective, I think there's an inherent contradiction here. The societal expectation to be successful cannot simultaneously be loose enough to be interpreted anyhow, and also powerful enough to eradicate societal mediocrity. They ought to pick a side. It's either this expectation is incredibly powerful and makes all of us geniuses, or this expectation is loose and personal. It cannot be both. The only way you are able to achieve internal motivation and an internal interpretation of what a legacy is when you are driven, as Tiamo says, by categorical imperatives that are unique to the individual. That doesn't happen on their side. They can't claim that you have individualized interpretations of legacies when we look at the history books, all the legacies have something in common. They're exceptional, they're memorable, and they rise above the rest. So me being a street sweeper, like Desmond says, even if I'm the best street sweeper in the world, you name 3 street sweepers that you know. We don't think there's this subjective interpretation of success that they claim happens. This is false. Why are we better than our opening? 1, we prove that genius and excellence exist outside of the societal expectation. So we prove to you that the presence of legacies or the creation of legacies happens independent of the societal expectation. Our extension is specifically on why the social expectation to leave a legacy, independent of whether legacies are good or bad, is itself inherently harmful. Then onto the case that closing opposition gives you quickly. 1, they tell you that you trade in the societal benefit for remembrance. And again, here we tell you that they haven't definitively proven this link between excellence excellence and the expectation to be excellent. If anything, we think that it is the opposite. Siamo tells you why. When individuals are focused on their ability to be remembered, even by a society that hasn't materialized yet, that might have different priorities or different understandings of excellence, they defocus on their work. And we would rather these geniuses focused on their capacity to achieve now, as opposed to focusing on the ability to impress people 100 years from now. But secondarily, the second actor that is harmed is the individual who is unable to actualize that brilliance. We think that the existence of this societal pressure means that people, again we posit, that are in the majority, because most people are not exceptional, but people who are exceptional are constantly platformed, so that creates the impression that being exceptional is the norm, as opposed to that being exceptional is the exception. We think that these individuals then are harmed, they're socially excluded, they're shamed, they're made to feel mediocre, even though quite literally they're just normal people. Why is it that we are unable to create the role models that Desmond tells you about in his speech? We think role models, again, are individuals who rise above the odds, despite the absence of infrastructure. So why do we celebrate people who are able to run marathons even though they have disabilities? Why do we celebrate children who get 15 distinctions in matric without having electricity? It is because they're doing it despite infrastructure. They can't claim that the presence of this narrative creates an incentive to build infrastructure. Vote CG.
I want us to start with government's silver bullet. Because their silver bullet is that society pressures you into achievements that you probably can't achieve, and that is bad. And I want to equally introduce you to a young, handsome man that had a mustache a couple of years ago. His name was Adolf Hitler. He had a lot of accomplishments, but society do not see him as leaving a legacy that is appreciated. And this is quite important, because even when you have accomplishments, even when you engage in certain things that show geniuses, society does not say that this is someone's legacy that we expect you to ascribe to. At the end of the introduction, I want you to ask them a question. What constitutes an appreciated legacy per society's expectation? Because if you listen to what government consistently tells you, they say A, society's expectation of a legacy would always have to be high, incredibly high, and people would always have to be geniuses. The question is, why? OG says because it's a high burden. Why? They don't explain. Closing government says it is because of a couple of birds that are flying in the sky. But they don't explain precisely why society has the incentive to always have to make it very high. Second thing they say is that the expectation is acontextual of the unique circumstances, and they don't really care about the personal thing that you are going through as an individual. It will always be something that you don't have the capacity to achieve. There is no explanation as to prove why society has an incentive to create this type of expectations for individuals as a type of legacy. What I will then do is to give you 3 pieces of responses. This response will prove to you why society, in most instances, does not create those sort of expectations as a legacy, and that inherently beats our opening, because our opening only asserts that in most instances the expectations meet individuals in a way that is good, and the expectations are created in a way that people have the capacity, but do not explain why society has the incentive to do this in that regard. 3 reasons why society has an incentive to be very, very reasonable, and you don't set incredibly high expectations for people that you don't have the capacity to be able to do so. First reason is because
because society wants to be self-preserving. Because the extent to which society can consistently exist depends on the amount of individuals that are willing to buy into that particular type of society. If people recognize that they live in a type of society that consistently isolates them but sets incredibly high expectations for them, these individuals are less likely going to want to be a part of the society. It means that there is more likely going to be fragmentation of the society and the society breaks down. Because the society wants to be self-preserving, they don't have an incentive to create unreasonably high expectations. What does this mean like? It essentially means that in certain contexts, society might say, maybe for you to leave a legacy, you might be kind to others. And generations after that will remind you for your kindness. You don't have to be a big doctor. You don't have to be the greatest person. You don't have to be a god. The kindness and all of these particular good virtues are things that you most likely would appreciate. This is quite crucial. There is completely no proof on their side. This response at least is a proof to explain why society doesn't set unreasonably high expectations. To buy their argument is to just buy the assertion because they just say so. We are doing the actual structural mechanisms that they are not. The second reason why society does not have an incentive to set unreasonably high expectations for individuals is because the structures of society that impose these expectations themselves will feel bad and will feel inadequate. That we are telling individuals to achieve these high expectations, but we ourselves were never able to achieve those high expectations. Because of their selfish incentive not to want to look bad, and because they don't want to look like the bad individuals, equally because of the propensity for them to lose their legitimacy at the point whereby they impose expectations on individuals where they could not meet the expectations themselves, they are less likely to impose these expectations. What does this look like? It means that in poor communities, you usually don't expect the average person to become an incredibly rich person, but you probably impose expectations that probably says that probably you should be a good person, or probably you should be able to meet this specific expectation at the point whereby you have the capacity to do so. Again, second structural mechanism of a response. No mechanism from their side to prove that, and that's the underlying piece upon which they build their entire case, and they never prove it, they just assert it. But the third reason is equally important. It's because people will consistently ask questions. Why do I have to fulfill this expectation before I can leave a legacy? Especially when that expectation is incredibly high. What that does is that it constantly generates conversations as to what a legacy should be or what should constitute a legacy. All of these conversations forms part of the building of structures that help individuals to be able to build their capacity, to be able to be a part of that legacy, or to be able to create a legacy for themselves. What this essentially means is that this is a structural mechanism that exists independent of what opening says, but it gives you the same impact of opening by creating the structural mechanism to allow for individuals to get access to capacity. But I'll go ahead, even if you don't buy any of our case analysis. But before I do that, I'll take opening.
Yeah, the idea that human wants are insatiable is the reason behind why the bar keeps getting raised. And the actual spectrum support as effective.
Yeah, so sure, the bar will keep getting raised. What I prove is that if the bar keeps getting raised in a way that consistently erodes the extent to which society can function, society doesn't have an incentive to raise that bar specifically that way. And society is most likely going to raise that way in a way that people actually have the capacity. This doesn't attack any of the responses that I've given so far. Second thing I want you to note is what the comparative is. Maybe it is true that the comparative is personal autonomy and individuals will still have the incentive to become better individuals for themselves. Why is this something that is detrimental? Because probably it is true that in their world people would still want to be geniuses. But these individuals, when they want to be geniuses, don't want to be geniuses for others, but they want to be geniuses for themselves. Because opening government calls that personal autonomy because it's devoid of a legacy. Why is that bad? In our world, in the pursuit of excellence, you are leaving a legacy, meaning that you have to leave an imprint on other individuals. In their world, in the pursuit of excellence, even when people have the incentive to pursue excellence, they do it devoid of the imprint on other individuals. And the reason why this is true is because of all the mechanisms that they give to you. That people will have an incentive to self-actualize, that people will want to still be better for themselves. But they do that independent of the help that they give to other individuals. What is the implication of this response and this comparative? Two things. First of all, the best case scenario is a world whereby you create geniuses that only benefits themselves but do not benefit others. It means that the scope of impact of helping other individuals is something that is larger on our world, where people have a legacy to ascribe to, and for that reason, the extent to which they utilize their geniuses should be to the help of other individuals, meaning that we help much more individuals as compared to their world. But then secondly, it equally means that we help the poor people, because it is in our that people don't ostracize the poor person, because if you ostracize the poor person, you have a bad legacy. So you can be a doctor, you can be the biggest person, but at the point where you die, people say that, oh, this person was an evil person, this person did all of the bad things. You don't have a good legacy, and society does not want that type of societal expectation of what a legacy should be. It means at the end of the day, on scope of benefit of impacting much more individuals, we prove to you why even if it is true that people have to strive so high, it impacts other individuals in that regard. Final thing then is that people can equally fail in their world. As a species, when people fail in our world, they have structures. When people fail in their world, there are no structures because it is internal. It's an internal expectation that you create for yourself, not a societal expectation. There are no conversations as to your mental health. At least in our world, it is communal, it is the entire society. We are proud to close in position.